Picture this: a priest, once revered in his homeland, now stands at the edge of a foreign kingdom, his robes tattered, his future uncertain. Exile was meant to break him, yet within years, he's whispering counsel into the ear of a king, shaping policies, even swaying wars. How did such a stunning reversal happen? This isn't just one story, it's a hidden pattern of history where exiled clergymen didn't just survive their banishment. They reinvented themselves as power brokers in courts far from home. These weren't mere refugees of faith. They were masters of diplomacy, carriers of secrets, and sometimes the quiet architects of empires. The medieval world was a chessboard of shifting alliances, where religion and politics collided in ways that would feel unimaginable today. A priest cast out from Paris might emerge as the most trusted advisor in Constantinople. A bishop exiled from England could become the key negotiator in Rome. Their journeys weren't just about survival, they were about leverage. Imagine the knowledge they carried, intimate details of their homeland's weaknesses, sacred texts with political undertones, even the private sins of rulers they'd left behind. These men turned exile into influence, using faith as both shield and weapon in the cutthroat game of medieval power. Why does this matter now? Because these stories tear down the myth that identity was fixed in the past. A banished priest wasn't doomed, he was adaptable. He could shed his old allegiances, blend into new cultures, and rise again under different banners. Their lives force us to ask, what does it mean to belong? How far would you go to reinvent yourself? And what hidden currents of history were shaped by these unlikely power players? From shadowed cloisters to glittering thrones, we're about to trace their extraordinary paths where faith met ambition, and banishment became the beginning, not the end. Exile was never just about leaving, it was about being ripped from the very world that defined you. For medieval priests, banishment often began with a single misstep, a sermon too bold, a loyalty questioned, or a king's pride wounded. Take Archbishop Anselm, the brilliant scholar who dared to challenge King William II of England over who controlled the church's power. One day, he was a spiritual leader with a seat at the royal table. The next, he was a fugitive, his name whispered with scorn in the halls he once walked freely. But Anselm's story wasn't unique. Across Europe, clergymen faced exile for heresy, political betrayal, or simply being on the losing side of a noble feud. The punishment wasn't just physical removal, it was a deliberate unraveling of their identity. Stripped of their parishes, their titles revoked, they became ghosts in their own lives. The journey into exile was its own kind of torment. Picture a bishop, once robed in finery, now trudging along muddy roads with nothing but a satchel of bread and a stolen cloak. Every border crossing carried danger bandits, suspicious locals, or worse, spies from their homeland sent to ensure they never returned. And then there was the weight of stigma. In an era where belonging meant survival, an exiled priest was mocked. Whispers followed them. Was he cast out for corruption? Did he anger God? Some towns turned them away at the gates. Others tolerated them only as long as they kept their heads bowed. Yet here's the twist. Exile didn't just break these men, it sharpened them. With no safety net, they learned to read rooms like scriptures. A banished priest might arrive in a foreign court with nothing but his wits, only to realize his knowledge of Latin made him indispensable as a scribe. Another, trained in canon law, could draft treaties that saved kingdoms from war. Survival demanded reinvention. The very skills that made them threats in one land, their education, their networks, their understanding of power, became their currency in another. Anselm, for instance, didn't fade into obscurity. He wandered Europe, his reputation as a scholar opening doors until even the Pope sought his counsel. Exile, it turned out, was less an ending than a brutal education. The question wasn't whether they'd adapt, it was how far they'd go to turn vulnerability into advantage. For an exiled priest, the first challenge wasn't just finding shelter, it was finding the right kind. Monasteries became sanctuaries in the truest sense, offering more than just a roof. The Benedictine order, with its sprawling network of abbeys across Europe, often served as a clandestine highway for displaced clergy. A monk expelled from France could whisper the right phrase at a Benedictine gate in Germany and find himself ushered inside, no questions asked. These were places where loyalty to the church often outweighed political grudges, but monasteries weren't just hiding spots, they were hubs of opportunity. A banished bishop might arrive penniless, only to be handed parchment and ink tools to rebuild his reputation through scholarship or correspondence with distant allies. Then there were the merchant cities where money talked louder than dogma. Venice, Bruges, and Cologne didn't care about a priest's past if he brought value to the table. An exiled clergyman with knowledge of royal courts could trade secrets for patronage, or leverage his literacy to draft contracts for illiterate merchants. In these bustling trade centers, survival demanded pragmatism. A French bishop fleeing persecution might wash up in Hungary, only to discover his fluency in Latin made him indispensable to a king desperate to communicate with Western allies. That's exactly what happened to one unnamed cleric in the 12th century, a man who arrived as a refugee and within years was drafting treaties that shifted Hungary's alliances. But refuge wasn't always peaceful. Rival kingdoms saw exiled priests as assets, not charity cases. A Spanish clergyman cast out by his own monarch might be welcomed in Aragon with open arms, his insider knowledge of Castilian politics worth its weight in gold. These weren't acts of kindness, they were calculated moves. Kings knew a banished priest carried more than just grievances, he carried intelligence, connections, and sometimes even the symbolic weight of divine legitimacy. The very act of sheltering an exile could be a thumb in the eye of a rival ruler. What's striking is how quickly these men turned desperation into strategy. A monastery stay wasn't just about waiting out the storm, it was about rebuilding credentials. A merchant city wasn't just a place to disappear, it was a stage to demonstrate one's worth. And a rival court, that was the ultimate chessboard. The exiled priest who arrived with nothing but a stolen cloak might leave with a title, a stipend, or even a seat at the council table. Their rise wasn't luck, it was the art of turning sanctuary into leverage. In a world where most rulers couldn't even sign their own names, an exiled priest carried something far more valuable than gold knowledge. Literacy was their secret weapon. While kings and nobles relied on others to read decrees or draft treaties, these banished clergymen arrived with the rare ability to turn spoken words into written law. Take Gerbert of Aurillac, a monk exiled from France under shady political circumstances. He didn't just survive his banishment, he thrived by becoming the tutor to a future Holy Roman Emperor. His mastery of mathematics, astronomy, and rhetoric skills honed in monastic schools made him a human library in a world starved for learning. Within years, he wasn't just teaching, he was advising monarchs, brokering alliances, and eventually wearing the papal tiara himself. But it wasn't just about reading and writing. These men understood the unspoken rules of power. A priest trained in canon law could spot loopholes in treaties that others missed. One exiled bishop in 12th century Germany famously redrafted a peace accord with subtle phrasing that gave his new patron the upper hand for decades. Theology, too, became a political tool. A clergyman who'd memorized scripture could justify anything, from tax exemptions to wars, by cherry-picking verses. When a Castilian king needed divine approval to seize a rival's lands, it was an exiled Portuguese cleric who provided the perfect biblical justification, earning himself a cushy bishopric in return. The real genius lay in how they packaged their skills. An illiterate duke might not care about Latin poetry, but he'd pay handsomely for someone who could compose flattering letters to the Pope. Administrative prowess opened even more doors. Banished priests often arrived with experience managing estates, collecting tithes, or keeping records, skills desperately needed in chaotic courts. One anonymous Franciscan, exiled from England during a royal feud, reinvented himself as the chief accountant for a Hungarian noble. Within 5 years, he'd streamlined the entire region's tax system, making his patron richer and himself indispensable. What made them truly dangerous was their network. A priest kicked out of Paris didn't just lose his home. He kept his connections to cardinals, scholars, and informants across Europe. Smart rulers realized harboring exiles meant tapping into that web. When Frederick II of Sicily welcomed a group of banished Templar knights, he wasn't being charitable. He was gaining access to their contacts from Jerusalem to London intelligence that helped him outmaneuver the Pope in their decades-long feud. The lesson was clear. In the medieval world, knowledge wasn't just power, it was currency. A disgraced clergyman could arrive penniless at a foreign court and within months be dining at the high table, not because of who he was, but because of what he knew. And the smartest exiles never gave away their leverage all at once. They doled out wisdom like chess moves, always keeping one strategic piece in reserve. After all, in the game of survival, the last scribe standing wasn't the one who wrote the most, but the one who left the right words unwritten. The leap from spiritual advisor to political kingmaker wasn't a sudden promotion. It was a slow, calculated dance on the edge of a knife. Consider Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the son of an Ipswich butcher who rose to become Henry VIII's right hand. Wolsey wasn't just whispering prayers in the king's ear. He was drafting international treaties, arranging marriages, even delaying Henry's infamous divorce when it suited his own ambitions. How did a clergyman technically loyal to Rome wield such secular power? The answer lies in the art of dual allegiance. These exiled priests became masters of serving two masters, the monarch who fed them and the Vatican who'd once ordained them. Wolsey's genius was making both believe he worked exclusively for them. To Henry, he was the consummate English statesman. To the Pope, he was Rome's eyes and ears in a rebellious court. But this balancing act demanded more than charm. It required a spy's instincts. Secret alliances flourished in the shadows. A bishop exiled from Burgundy might swear fealty to the German emperor while secretly funneling intelligence back to French cardinals through coded missives hidden in liturgical books. The Vatican's archives still hold letters where exiled clergy wrote of court intrigues in seemingly innocent biblical metaphors. Phrases like, "the prodigal son repents," could signal a king's weakening resolve, while "the mustard seed grows" might hint at an impending rebellion. These men weren't just advisors, they were living switchboards connecting rival powers. The stakes of their double game were mortal. One misstep could mean losing everything. Look at Reginald Pole, the English cardinal exiled for opposing Henry VIII's break with Rome. From his sanctuary in Italy, Pole became the Vatican's chief strategist against England, yet he still had relatives at Henry's court. His letters to them, layered with ambiguous piety, kept his options open. Was he a loyal son of the church or a pragmatist waiting to reconcile with his homeland? Even now, historians debate his true loyalties. That ambiguity wasn't accidental, it was survival. What's astonishing is how these clergymen turned their spiritual authority into political capital. A banished priest couldn't command armies, but he could anoint kings or deny them legitimacy. When the Holy Roman Emperor needed papal approval to claim Naples, it was an exiled Neapolitan bishop who brokered the deal, trading his influence in Rome for a return to favor. Others played the long game, embedding themselves so deeply in foreign courts that their advice became law. By the time rulers realized they'd outsourced their sovereignty to a clerical advisor, it was too late. The real power wasn't always on the throne. Sometimes it stood just behind it, wearing a bishop's ring and smiling faintly at the chaos it had orchestrated. Yet their greatest weapon wasn't deception, it was perception. These men understood that in politics, the appearance of divine favor could outweigh actual military might. A king might scoff at a priest's threats, but would he risk the whispers that God had withdrawn his blessing? That intangible authority, the lingering sense that these exiles carried some unearthly insight, let them shape empires without ever drawing a sword. They wrote the rules, then convinced the powerful the rules had always been there, written in some celestial text only they could read. And in that space between heavenly mandate and earthly ambition, the exiled priests didn't just serve history, they rewrote it. While kings and emperors made grand speeches in torchlit halls, the real diplomacy of medieval Europe often happened in hushed monastery corridors or merchant inns, places where exiled priests traded secrets like sacramental wine. These weren't just men of the cloth, they were shadow diplomats, weaving webs of influence across borders with a monk's discretion and a spy's instincts. Take the Council of Constance in the early 15th century, where exiled bishops, technically powerless, orchestrated the election of Pope Martin V. How? Because banishment had scattered them like seeds, a French bishop whispering to German cardinals here, a Spanish cleric trading favors with Italian nobles there. Their very exile made them perfect intermediaries, too disconnected to threaten anyone's throne, yet too connected to ignore. Their methods were ingenious. A letter from an exiled priest could bypass formal channels entirely, carried by pilgrim monks or tucked into shipments of Venetian silk. One notorious case involved a Hungarian bishop, expelled for heresy, who brokered a truce between Poland and Lithuania by framing the deal as a religious concord, slipping political terms between lines about Christian unity. Rulers tolerated these backchannel dealings because clergymen spoke a lingua franca of scripture and ritual that transcended petty rivalries. When a king's envoy might be seen as a provocateur, a priest could pose as a humble peacemaker, even while negotiating territorial concessions. But trust was a brittle commodity. The smartest exiles hedged their bets by never fully committing. A bishop advising the Holy Roman Emperor might simultaneously send coded reports to the French crown, using psalm numbers as dates or saints' feast days as drop points. The Vatican's archives reveal letters where exiled clergy referred to allies as flocks and enemies as wolves, language pious enough to avoid suspicion, but crystal clear to insiders. Their greatest shield wasn't deception, but ambiguity. By keeping multiple patrons guessing where their true loyalties lay, they ensured no single ruler could afford to call their bluff. The true masterpiece of their craft was turning spiritual authority into diplomatic capital. An exiled priest couldn't command armies, but he could anoint their purpose. When the King of Denmark needed justification to invade Sweden, it was a banished Swedish cleric who declared the war, a crusade against schismatics, twisting theology into a casus belli. Others played longer games. A Castilian friar, exiled to Portugal, spent years quietly aligning Lisbon's interests with Rome's until his adopted homeland became the Vatican's chief ally against Spain. These men didn't just serve power, they reshaped it, one carefully worded blessing at a time. What's chilling is how their legacy lingers. Modern intelligence agencies still study their tradecraft. The way exiled priests used pilgrim routes as spy networks or turned confessional secrecy into plausible deniability. But perhaps their most enduring lesson was in the art of strategic belonging. By never fully being of any kingdom, they became indispensable to all. In a fractured world, the ultimate power didn't always sit on a throne. Sometimes it wore a frayed cassock and carried a message no one else dared to deliver. Loyalty in exile was never a simple vow. It was a high-stakes performance, a dance where one misstep could mean a crown's favor or a headsman's axe. Consider the case of Thomas Becket's exiled allies after his murder. These clergymen scattered across Europe didn't just mourn their fallen leader, they weaponized their grief. In Paris, one of Becket's protégés translated Greek philosophical texts for the French court, subtly weaving critiques of tyrannical kings into the footnotes. In Rome, another drafted legal arguments that framed Henry II as a modern-day Herod, turning scholarship into propaganda. Their service wasn't just useful, it was proof of allegiance to a cause larger than any single throne. And rulers paid attention. The French king, eager to embarrass his English rival, granted these exiles land and titles, transforming them from fugitives into cultural arbiters. But loyalty had its dark mirror, betrayal. For every exiled priest who rose through faithful service, another fell for playing both sides. Take the tragic case of Bishop Arnulf of Lycia. Exiled from Normandy for opposing his duke, he initially thrived in the English court, using his legal expertise to help Henry II consolidate power. But when Arnulf secretly corresponded with rebels back home, hoping to broker a return, Henry's spies intercepted the letters. The bishop's fate, a cold cell in the Tower of London where he died forgotten. His story was a grim reminder. In the medieval world, divided loyalties were a death sentence. The smartest exiles understood that loyalty wasn't just declared, it was demonstrated through irreplaceable skills. A banished monk from Cluny might arrive in Castile with nothing but a tattered breviary, only to be handed the task of translating Arabic medical texts into Latin. His work didn't just heal bodies, it healed his standing, proving his value to a kingdom hungry for knowledge. Others legitimized rulers through sheer theatricality. When the exiled Archbishop of Mainz crowned an anti-king in Germany during the 12th century, he didn't just place a crown, he staged a full coronation mass, complete with fabricated relics, miraculously appearing to bless the usurper. The message was clear: God endorsed this coup, and the exile holding the scepter was his mouthpiece. What's fascinating is how these men navigated the paradox of their position. To survive, they had to serve new masters, but to matter, they had to retain some shred of independence. The most successful walked this tightrope by creating dependencies. A Hungarian priest exiled to Poland didn't just teach the royal children Latin, he made himself the only person who could decipher their grandmother's encrypted letters from Budapest. Suddenly, his loyalty became impossible to question without losing access to critical intelligence. Others specialized in the art of the unsolvable problem. A Saxon canon expelled during a papal schism became indispensable to the Danish court by being the sole scholar who could untangle the conflicting dates of Easter calculations, a crisis that had stalled diplomacy for years. The rewards for proving loyalty could border on the absurd. One Italian friar, exiled for heresy, reinvented himself as a dietary advisor to the King of Aragon, prescribing fasting regimens that accidentally aligned with the king's political schedule. His payment, a palace apartment and a personal vineyard, But the true prize was influence. The exiled clergy who thrived weren't just servants, they became gatekeepers. Control the flow of translations, and you shaped what ideas entered a kingdom. Draft the laws, and you decided which customs became permanent. Anoint the rulers, and you determined whose power God himself seemed to endorse. Yet their greatest legacy might be the cultural bridges they built, often unintentionally. A priest fleeing English persecution in Normandy would carry French poetry to German courts. A bishop exiled from Toledo would introduce Arabic astronomy to Parisian scholars. In a world fractured by borders and dialects, these men became living conduits, not just of loyalty, but of everything from medicine to music. The very act of proving their worth to new patrons meant stitching together a patchwork Europe, one translated text or crowned head at a time. And in that unlikeliest of roles, the exiled priest as cultural smuggler, they did more than survive. They quietly rewrote what it meant to belong to a kingdom, a faith, or even an age. The most enduring legacy of these exiled priests wasn't just the power they wielded, it was the ideas they carried like sacred contraband across forbidden borders. Picture a Byzantine scholar fleeing Constantinople as Ottoman forces breach the walls, his arms laden not with gold, but with crumbling manuscripts of Plato and Aristotle. These men didn't just escape with their lives, they smuggled out the intellectual foundations of the Renaissance. When figures like Manuel Chrysoloras arrived in Florence, they didn't come as beggars. They were human libraries bearing Greek texts lost to the West for centuries. Suddenly, Italian humanists could read Homer in the original, and architects pored over forgotten diagrams of Byzantine domes. The exiled clergy became living bridges between worlds, turning their displacement into Europe's great cultural transfusion. But their influence went far beyond books. A French monk exiled to Burgundy might introduce the pointed arches of his homeland's cathedrals to local builders, unknowingly shaping Gothic architecture for generations. Legal concepts traveled the same way. When Norman clerics expelled from England washed up in Sicily, they brought with them the meticulous record-keeping of the Domesday Book, a bureaucratic revolution for the island's chaotic courts. Even culinary habits shifted. One banished Spanish friar's letters reveal how he taught Neapolitan nuns to sweeten marzipan with Moorish-inspired rosewater, creating a confectionery craze that outlasted kingdoms. Not all these imports were welcomed. The clash between old and new could spark riots. In 12th century Cologne, locals burned down a monastery after exiled Lombard monks tried replacing traditional plainchant with polyphonic harmonies they'd learned in France. The devil sings in many voices. The mob screamed as the walls collapsed. Elsewhere, resistance was subtler. A Hungarian bishop's attempt to introduce Roman law to his adoptive Polish court backfired when nobles accused him of trading our ancestors' justice for foreign tricks. He spent his final years copying local customs into Latin, a grudging compromise between innovation and tradition. The irony, many of these cultural ambassadors never saw their impact. The Byzantine scholar who taught Venetian artists the secrets of gold leaf mosaics died penniless in a rented room. The Irish monk whose illuminated manuscripts inspired Bavarian scribes was buried in an unmarked grave. Yet their accidental pilgrimages reshaped continents. When we admire the classical curves of a Renaissance palace or trace the origins of international law, we're often glimpsing the fingerprints of priests who arrived as outcasts and left as unwitting revolutionaries. Their greatest power wasn't in the thrones they advised, but in the invisible threads they stitched between worlds, threads that, centuries later, still hold our shared culture together. Exile didn't just offer sanctuary, it became a petri dish for radical ideas. When Jan Hus, the fiery Bohemian preacher, was banished from Prague, his heresy trials followed him like shadows. But distance from the centers of power didn't silence him. It amplified his voice, from rural castles to underground networks. Huse's sermons on church corruption spread like wildfire, his exile transforming him from a lone critic into a symbol of resistance. Here's the paradox: the very act of banishment often gave reformist priests their most potent weapon, the freedom to preach without restraint. No archbishop could silence them now, no local noble could confiscate their pulpits. Yet this freedom came at a cost. Every unorthodox sermon risked not just their own necks, but the safety of those who harbored them. The line between heresy and innovation blurred with terrifying consequences. Take the case of Peter Waldo, the wealthy merchant-turned-preacher exiled from Lyon for distributing vernacular Bibles. In his homeland, he'd been a nuisance. In the Alpine valleys, he became the founder of a movement. His followers, the Waldensians, rejected papal authority and embraced poverty ideas that might have been debated in a university, but became fatal when preached in the open. Local lords tolerated them at first, until Rome branded them heretics. Suddenly, sheltering Waldo's disciples meant risking excommunication. Exile didn't erase conflict, it exported it, turning quiet valleys into battlegrounds for theological wars. What's chilling is how these debates followed ancient fault lines. A priest exiled from Paris for questioning transubstantiation might find sympathetic ears in Lombardy, where centuries-old disputes over the Eucharist still simmered. Others weaponized regional rivalries. When the radical Franciscan spirituals fled persecution in Provence, they didn't abandon their apocalyptic visions, they repackaged them for Catalan nobles resentful of French influence. Their message of Christ's imminent return became entangled with anti-royal sentiment, proving that theological rebellion could ignite political explosions. Yet not all exiled reformers were firebrands. Some wielded subtlety like a scalpel. Bishop Nicolaus of Cusa, banished during the chaos of the Great Schism, spent his exile drafting proposals for church unity so nuanced that both Rome and Constantinople initially applauded them until they realized his ideas undermined their absolute authority. His treatise De Concordantia Catholica became a blueprint for conciliarism, the notion that church councils outranked popes. It was heresy dressed in diplomatic silk, and it nearly toppled the Vatican's power structure. The darkest irony: many of these men never sought revolution. Hus begged for dialogue with the Council of Constance, only to be burned at the stake. Waldo never renounced his Catholic faith, yet died hunted. Their stories reveal exile's cruelest twist. It forced clergy to choose between fading into obscurity or doubling down on the very ideas that got them banished. And for those who chose the latter, their greatest act of reinvention wasn't adapting to a new land, it was refusing to let anyone, even kings or popes, dictate what they could believe. But this intellectual defiance had a price. The same networks that smuggled forbidden texts could also carry death warrants. When the Dominican Inquisitor Bernard Gui tracked down exiled Cathars in northern Italy, he didn't just arrest them, he methodically dismantled their protectors, exposing how a single heretic could doom an entire village. Exile wasn't escape, it was a game of dominoes where one fallen priest could topple a region's fragile tolerance. The burn marks on medieval maps towns like Béziers, where thousands were massacred as collateral damage in heresy purges, stand as grim reminders that ideas, once loose, could be far more dangerous than the men who carried them. And so we're left with an unsettling question. Did these exiled priests reshape the world despite their persecution, or because of it? The fire that consumed Hus at Constance didn't extinguish his ideas. It scattered them like embers, igniting the Hussite wars that reshaped Central Europe. Waldo's humble Bible translations outlasted papal bulls by centuries, morphing into Protestantism's core tenets. Even failures like the spirituals left echoes, their calls for apostolic poverty resurfacing in Luther's revolt. Exile, it seems, was less an ending than a distorting mirror, magnifying some voices, fragmenting others, but never truly silencing them. The real heresy wasn't in their words, but in the dangerous truth they revealed, that no authority, no matter how absolute, could control where an idea might take root. Power always came with peril, and for exiled clergy, the higher they climbed, the more spectacular their falls could be. Consider the infamous case of Bishop Rodrigo of Seville, who fled Spain after embezzling cathedral funds, only to reinvent himself as the spiritual advisor to a young German duke. At first, Rodrigo played the humble penitent, offering shrewd financial advice that stabilized the duke's bankrupt treasury. But within years, he'd woven himself into every thread of power, controlling access to the duke, skimming taxes, even arranging marriages for noble families for a fee. His downfall came when he grew careless, demanding a cut of silver mines the duke considered his personal birthright. The betrayal was too blatant to ignore. Rodrigo spent his last years in a damp tower, scratching psalms onto the walls with his fingernails, while the duke's treasurer meticulously reclaimed every stolen coin. Not all scandals were financial. Some exiles gambled with love and lost. The story of Brother Alaric, a French monk exiled to Burgundy, reads like a medieval soap opera. After charming his way into the Dowager Countess's confidence as her confessor, he secretly orchestrated her remarriage to a distant cousin, a man who just happened to be Alaric's childhood friend. When the Countess died mysteriously weeks later, leaving her fortune to the new husband, rumors spread faster than plague. Alaric's fate, a trial so sensational, chroniclers noted townsfolk selling seats in the courtroom. His execution by hanging was a grim reminder. Exile might erase your past, but not your sins. Then there were the political gambits that backfired spectacularly. Archbishop Adalbert of Bremen, exiled for defying the Holy Roman Emperor, sought refuge with the Danish king, only to secretly promise the Swedes he'd undermine Denmark's trade in exchange for a bishopric. When letters detailing the double cross were intercepted, the Danes didn't bother with imprisonment. They marooned Adalbert on a barren Baltic island with nothing but a fishing net and a Bible, leaving him to ponder whether betrayal or stupidity had doomed him. Yet for every cautionary tale, there were exiled clergy who wielded power with surprising integrity. Take Bishop Elzayar of Sabran, a Provençal nobleman turned Franciscan who was exiled during a papal schism. Rather than exploit his influence at the Neapolitan court, he used it to broker peace between warring families, famously refusing even a bed softer than straw lest it corrupt his humility. His legacy, a cult of followers who remembered him not for schemes, but for washing paupers' feet with the same hands that had anointed kings. The difference between those who crashed and those who endured often lay in their relationship with memory. The corrupt exiles acted as if exile had erased their past, free to reinvent themselves without consequence. The wiser ones knew better. They understood that every court had scribes recording their deeds, every rival waiting for a misstep. Their power wasn't in forgetting where they came from, but in letting their origins anchor them. When the Spanish bishop Rodrigo died in his cell, not even his jailers attended the burial. But when Elzayar passed, the Neapolitan king carried his coffin. In the end, exile didn't dictate their legacy, choices did. And those choices whispered a warning across centuries. Power borrowed is never truly owned. The moment you forget that, the ground beneath you was always borrowed too. Some of the most astonishing success stories began with nothing but a wooden staff and a vow of poverty. Take Saint Columbanus, the Irish monk exiled from his homeland for preaching reforms too zealously. When he crossed into Burgundy around the year 590, he carried no gold, no royal letters of introduction, just a handful of followers and an unshakable conviction. Within a decade, that ragged band had founded Luxeuil Abbey, a monastic powerhouse that would educate future saints and shape Frankish Christianity for centuries. But Columbanus wasn't alone. His countrymen fanned out across Europe like spiritual entrepreneurs, planting monastic communities in the Swiss Alps, the Italian Apennines, even the forests of Bavaria. These weren't just places of prayer, they were cultural power stations. At Bobbio in northern Italy, Irish monks preserved classical texts that might otherwise have been lost to the Dark Ages. In St. Gallen, they devised a library system so sophisticated it became the model for medieval scholarship, yet not all legacies were built on parchment and prayer beads. Some exiled clergymen played a longer game, one of bloodlines and bridal politics, when Bishop Bernwood of Hildesheim, himself the grandson of exiled Saxon nobility, arranged his niece's marriage to the Duke of Swabia. He wasn't just securing her future. He was embedding his family into the scaffolding of empire. This was dynastic alchemy, turning exile into aristocracy. By the 12th century, descendants of banished priests could be found in royal courts from Aragon to Poland, their genealogies a patchwork of church mitres and coronets. The Vatican's archives still hold betrothal contracts where clauses about spiritual guidance thinly veil clauses transferring church lands to noble sons-in-law. The irony, many of these men were celebrated abroad as visionaries while being vilified at home. Irish annals referred to Columbanus as the wanderer who forgot his roots, even as Frankish chroniclers hailed him as a saint. For every monastery founded on foreign soil, there was a whispering campaign back home, accusations that these exiles had abandoned their people to curry favor with foreign kings. The truth was more complicated. Exiled priests often sent money and manuscripts back to their homelands or used their influence to protect them. When Viking raiders threatened Ireland, it was Irish monks in Charlemagne's court who persuaded him to send military aid. Their loyalty wasn't gone. It had stretched across borders like the roots of a great oak, invisible but vital. What's remarkable is how tangible their legacies remain. Walk into the Cathedral of Cologne, and you'll find stained glass donated by descendants of an exiled Breton bishop. Visit the University of Paris's oldest lecture hall, and you're standing where scholars trained by Irish monks once debated theology. Even modern European royalty can trace lineages back to those strategic medieval marriages. The Habsburg jawline might owe as much to a scheming bishop's niece as to any king's bloodline. These men understood that true influence wasn't just about who knelt before you today, but who would remember your name 500 years later. They built in stone, in parchment, and most cunningly of all, in the unbroken chain of generations, proving that exile wasn't the end of a story, but the first page of a dynasty. For a banished priest, the dream of homecoming flickered like a candle in a storm, bright with hope, but easily snuffed. Consider Pope Gregory VII, who spent his final years exiled in Salerno, gazing toward Rome from a borrowed palace. Even as his health failed, he clung to the belief that he'd reclaim St. Peter's throne. But the gates of Rome stayed shut, guarded by the very emperor who'd driven him out. Gregory's story wasn't unique. Most exiled clergy never set foot in their homelands again, yet the past refused to release them. Letters from old enemies arrived like clockwork, some offering hollow reconciliation, others gloating over their downfall. A bishop who'd fled England might receive a taunting missive describing how his former cathedral now housed his rival's coat of arms. These weren't just personal wounds, they were strategic vulnerabilities. Every grudge left unpaid could be weaponized by their new patrons. The smartest exiles turned nostalgia into leverage. When King Philip of France needed to pressure England, he didn't send soldiers. He hosted a banquet for exiled English clergy. ensuring their raised cups were noted by spies. The message was clear: France held England's spiritual legitimacy in its wine cellars. Other rulers played subtler games. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II famously rehabilitated a group of banished Templars, not out of piety, but to unsettle the French crown which had persecuted them. By offering sanctuary, Frederick gained not just their military expertise, but the psychological upper hand. Every rehabilitated exile was a living reproach to his enemies. Yet the ghosts of home could also paralyze. Some clergymen, like Archbishop Anselm, spent years petitioning for return, their focus split between serving new patrons and lobbying old ones. The cost of this divided attention was steep. Anselm's temporary reconciliation with England's king came only after he'd sacrificed hard-won influence in Rome, a trade that left him weaker in both courts. Others grew reckless. The exiled Bishop of Liege, obsessed with reclaiming his diocese, funneled his adoptive duchy's funds into bribing papal legates. When the scheme collapsed, his new patron stripped him of everything but his prayer books. The cruelest twist: even successful returns rarely brought peace. When Pope Innocent IV finally re-entered Rome after years exiled in Lyon, he found the Vatican's treasury emptied and its walls scrawled with insults. The city that had once cheered him now eyed him as a foreigner. Power, it seemed, had a half-life, and exile eroded it faster than time. For every priest who reclaimed a throne, there were a dozen who discovered home had become another country, its alleys lined with strangers who recited their name like a folktale. What lingers is how these unresolved pasts shaped history. A bishop who'd lost his homeland to Viking raiders might urge his new Frankish patrons to slaughter pagan prisoners without trial. An English cleric exiled during the Norman conquest could spend decades steering French policy toward invading his lost island. The bitterest irony: some of medieval Europe's most consequential wars weren't fought over land or gold, but over the unpaid emotional debts of exiled priests, men who, from thousands of miles away, whispered vengeance into kings' ears like fallen angels remembering heaven. Their stories force a haunting question: can you ever truly go back, or does exile, like a baptism of ashes, leave you forever changed? The parchment might fade, the seals might crack, but the ink of banishment never fully washes away. Dual allegiance wasn't just a tightrope walk, it was a high-wire act performed over a pit of swords. Take Cardinal Bessarion, the Byzantine scholar who fled Constantinople's fall only to become a papal legate in Italy. On the surface, he was Rome's loyal servant, championing crusades to reclaim his homeland. But his private letters reveal agonized debates. Should he push the Vatican to prioritize saving Greek Christians or focus on unifying the fractured Latin Church? Bessarion's dilemma was universal among exiled clergy. Their hearts often remained tethered to the lands they'd lost, even as their survival depended on pleasing new patrons. The smartest operators turned this tension into an art form. Archbishop Nicodemus of Gran, exiled from Hungary after a failed revolt, became the Polish king's most trusted advisor, while secretly funneling coded messages to Hungarian rebels through merchant networks. His genius lay in compartmentalization. To Warsaw, he was the architect of tax reforms. To Budapest, he was the keeper of royal secrets. This wasn't mere duplicity, it was strategic ambiguity. By never fully committing to either side, Nicodemus ensured both needed him. When the Polish crown discovered his double game, they looked the other way. Why? Because his treason had delivered them Hungary's military plans for a decade. Yet not all dual loyalties were so neatly balanced. The darker side emerged when exiled clergy became more zealous than their hosts. After fleeing England during Henry VIII's purge of monasteries, Cistercian monks in Flanders didn't just resent the Tudor king, they radicalized. Their abbey became a hub for plots to assassinate Henry's agents, with sermons framing violence as holy retribution. Here, Exile didn't dilute nationalism, it distilled it into something far more volatile. The same pattern played out in Iberia, where priests expelled from Muslim Granada preached crusades with a fury that shocked even their Christian patrons. The Vatican watched these games with wary eyes. Some exiled bishops received cryptic orders from Rome, their instructions hidden in liturgical calendars or psalm annotations. One Venetian agent's memoir describes how a banished Hungarian cardinal used choir rehearsals to pass intelligence, singing certain hymns signaled which Alpine passes were safe for papal troops. But Rome's grip was slippery. The farther clergy roamed, the more their allegiances frayed. By the 15th century, popes complained of exiled bishops who pray in Latin but swear allegiance in every tongue. What's revealing is how host kingdoms weaponized these divided loyalties. The French court famously housed 3 rival factions of exiled Scottish clergy, each claiming to represent the true Scottish Church, and played them against one another to influence Edinburgh's politics. Other rulers demanded increasingly outrageous proofs of loyalty. A Castilian duke forced an exiled Portuguese bishop to publicly denounce his homeland's saints as heretics before granting him sanctuary. The bishop complied but later smuggled relics of those same saints into Castile, hiding them in altars as silent rebuttals. This dance of allegiance reshaped more than individual fates, it bent the arc of history. When the Avignon papacy needed legitimacy during the Great Schism, it didn't rely on French cardinals. It imported exiled Italian clergy, whose very presence suggested Rome had chosen Avignon. Centuries later, Protestant reformers would exploit the same dynamic, recruiting disaffected Catholic priests to lend credibility to their breakaway movements. Exile, it seemed, didn't just test loyalty, it became the crucible where new loyalties were forged. Perhaps the most poignant lesson lies in the small acts of defiance. An Irish monk in Normandy copying his homeland's myths into the margins of a liturgical book. A Greek bishop in Venice sneaking icons of Constantinople's fallen churches into cathedral mosaics. These weren't just nostalgia, they were declarations that no exile could fully erase where they'd begun. The lands they'd lost lived on in their rituals, their accents, even the way they broke bread. And in that stubborn preservation of memory, they proved a profound truth. Allegiance might be negotiated, but identity was carried in the bones. The robe of a priest didn't just hide a cassock, it could conceal a trove of secrets. During the Anglo-French Wars of the 14th century, exiled clergymen became the era's most unlikely spies, their spiritual authority providing the perfect cover for espionage. Take the case of Brother Etienne, a Franciscan expelled from Paris for moral laxity, who reappeared in London as a humble confessor to the English royal court. No one questioned his frequent visits to coastal monasteries until French ships began mysteriously avoiding ambushes near Dover. Only later did interrogators uncover the truth. Etienne had been smuggling tide charts to French admirals, scribbled in the margins of illuminated psalters. His method was fiendishly simple. By replacing Latin hymns with coded nautical coordinates during choir practice, he turned sacred music into a weapon of war. But the stakes were deadly. When a Flemish bishop, Gerard of Cambrai, was caught relaying English troop movements through seemingly innocent pilgrimage letters, each saint's feast day corresponding to a military position, his punishment was swift. Stripped of his clerical protections, he was hanged as a common criminal, his body left to rot as a warning. The Church, ever pragmatic, distanced itself from these fallen agents. A papal bull from 1378 explicitly forbade clergy from carrying worldly correspondence, but loopholes abounded. A clever priest could argue that smuggling a map wasn't treason, it was preserving Christian unity by preventing bloodshed. The psychological toll of this double life was immense. Private journals from the period reveal tortured souls. One anonymous Benedictine, operating in Calais, wrote of blessing soldiers by day while sketching their fortifications by candlelight, his hand shaking so violently the ink smudged. "I absolve their sins," he scrawled, "yet who absolves mine?" Others rationalized their actions as divine service. A Lancastrian chaplain exiled to Burgundy insisted his espionage protected true faith from corrupt rivals, telling his confessor that lying for a higher truth was no sin at all. What's chilling is how easily spiritual tools became instruments of deception. The confessional seal, meant to safeguard penitents' secrets, allowed priests to extract intelligence without suspicion. Pilgrim badges worn to signify devotion could mark couriers for clandestine meetings. Even communion wafers weren't safe. One intercepted French agent hollowed them out to hide tiny slips of vellum listing English supply routes. Yet for all their skills, these priest spies faced an insoluble dilemma: serve their earthly patrons too well, and they risked damnation for betraying their vows. Refuse, and they'd lose the protection keeping them alive. Perhaps that's why so many died mid-mission, their final letters begging for last rites from rival priests who may have been spies themselves. In the shadows of war, the line between shepherd and wolf was perilously thin, and for these men, walking it became a tightrope over hell itself. Between the lines of official chronicles and royal decrees, the true weight of exile emerges in the private writings these clergymen left behind, ink-stained pages heavy with loneliness, threaded with guilt, or in rare cases, crackling with quiet triumph. Take the diary of Bishop Arnulf of Lycia, penned during his English exile after falling from Norman favor. His entries shift from furious Latin denunciations of his enemies to startlingly vulnerable passages where he describes pressing his forehead against cold chapel walls, whispering psalms not for piety, but to drown out the sound of his own weeping. Then there's the memoir of an anonymous Serbian monk exiled to Mount Athos, who sketched his homeland's mountains in the margins of his prayer book, each jagged peak a silent scream of homesickness. These weren't just records, they were confessionals without priests. The guilt some carried was crushing. A fragment survives from a Hungarian canon exiled for failing to protect his cathedral during a Mongol raid. His parchment is blotched where tears fell as he listed the names of slain choirboys, each followed by the same phrase, "May God forgive my cowardice, for I cannot." Others grappled with moral compromises. The Welsh priest Rhys ap Griffith's coded journal reveals how he justified spying for the French against England, not for gold, but to secure a pardon for his brother back in Cardiff. Is betrayal holy when it saves a life? He scrawled, the ink dug deep into the vellum as if trying to carve out an answer. Yet not all these texts were stained with remorse. Some pulsed with defiant pride. Archbishop Baldwin of Triers' exile memoirs read like a tactical manual, boasting how he played the Holy Roman Emperor and the Duke of Burgundy against each other like a chess master moving pawns of gold. His descriptions of feigning illness to avoid swearing loyalty oaths reveal a man who relished the game as much as the victory. Even more striking are the rare accounts from lower-ranked clergy, like Sister Margaret of Magdeburg, whose smuggled letters detail how she turned her banishment into opportunity, organizing a network of exiled nuns to copy and distribute banned mystical texts across Saxony. What makes these writings invaluable isn't just their raw humanity, it's the histories they preserved that official records erased. When the Vikings sacked Lindisfarne, it was an exiled monk named Eadfrith who documented the massacre in a letter so vivid modern archaeologists used it to locate mass graves. Similarly, a Florentine friar's diary from his Avignon exile preserved recipes, jokes, and even children's rhymes from pre-plague Tuscany, a cultural snapshot no chronicler would have deemed worth recording. These men and women became accidental archivists, their personal anguish bottling fragments of worlds that might otherwise have vanished. The most poignant entries blur the line between prayer and plea. In a crumbling manuscript now housed in Vienna, a Bohemian priest exiled during the Hussite Wars drew his own hands over and over in the margins, sometimes clasped in prayer, sometimes gripping the page like a drowning man clutching driftwood. Nearby, he wrote just one phrase repeated like a mantra: "I was here, I mattered." In that simple declaration lies the true power of these texts. They remind us that behind every political maneuver, every treaty signed or throne toppled, stood flesh and blood humans who grieved, doubted, and in their darkest hours reached for ink to prove they hadn't disappeared. These documents do more than humanize, they rewrite history's ledger. Official chronicles might record that Bishop Otto returned from exile in 1142, but only his personal psalter reveals he spent those years secretly teaching local serfs to read, using charcoal on barn walls when parchment ran out. The Vatican's archives tell us Cardinal Orsini mediated a peace in 1209. His diary confesses he did it by blackmailing both sides with their ancestors' sins. Such revelations force us to ask, how much of what we call history is just the surface, while the real currents flow unseen in these fragile, ink-stained pages? Perhaps that's their ultimate rebellion. In an age where kings controlled the scribes and popes dictated the narratives, these exiled priests snatched back their quills. They left behind not just accounts of what power did to them, but proof of what they did with power, even when all they had left was the power to remember and the stubborn courage to write it down. When libraries burned and cities fell, it was often the exiled priests who waded into the smoke to rescue what others abandoned, not gold or relics, but books. Picture the chaotic sack of Constantinople in 1204, where French crusaders tossed illuminated manuscripts into bonfires to heat their wine. Amid the carnage, a cluster of Greek monks scrambled through collapsing scriptoria, stuffing texts into their robes until the fabric strained at the seams. These men weren't just saving parchment, they were smuggling the future. Within decades, those salvaged manuscripts would fuel the Italian Renaissance, their marginal notes becoming lecture material for scholars like Petrarch. But this wasn't altruism, it was survival with a side agenda. Every rescued volume made exiled clergy more valuable to their new patrons. A Benedictine fleeing Viking raids might arrive in charters with a crumbling copy of Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy, only to find the local bishop offering him a teaching post before the ink on his travel papers dried. The logistics of these rescue missions were as daring as they were desperate. Some priests sewed pages into their cloaks, pretending to wear extra layers against the cold. Others bribed illiterate soldiers with communion wine to look the other way while they looted their own monasteries. The most systematic operators used merchant networks, like the exiled Coptic monks who disguised Aristotle's works as Egyptian cotton shipments to sneak them past caliphate censors. But the real genius lay in how they repackaged knowledge for new audiences. A Syrian cleric exiled to Sicily might translate Arabic medical texts into Latin, quietly inserting Christian references to make them palatable to European patrons. This wasn't just preservation, it was intellectual alchemy, turning foreign ideas into acceptable currency. Yet these literary lifelines came with strings attached. Possessing rare texts gave exiled clergy leverage, and the smartest wielded it ruthlessly. When Bishop Thierry of Chartres needed the Pope's support against a rival, he didn't send gold. he gifted a newly discovered manuscript of Roman civil law, knowing Vatican lawyers would drool over its strategic value. Other times, knowledge became ransom. An exiled Armenian archbishop held onto the only copy of a lost Herodotus volume for years, releasing it page by page as the Byzantine emperor met his demands for church repairs. The unspoken rule was clear. In exile, a book wasn't just a book. It was a hostage, a bribe, or sometimes a ticking time bomb. The most explosive texts weren't ancient scrolls but contemporary accounts. A priest expelled from the Norman court carried detailed records of William the Conqueror's questionable lineage, a dossier he selectively leaked to destabilize Anglo-Norman alliances. Another, fleeing the Albigensian Crusade, smuggled out lists of Cathar sympathizers that later blackmailed half the Languedoc nobility. These weren't librarians, they were knowledge brokers trading in secrets wrapped in sheepskin. What's astonishing is how their hustle shaped entire disciplines. The medical school at Salerno owed its breakthroughs to exiled Jewish doctors who'd smuggled Arabic anatomy texts past Christian censors. Parisian scholasticism bloomed because Irish monks showed up with long-lost logic treatises from Alexandria. Even chivalric romance got a reboot when Byzantine refugees introduced French poets to Homer. The medieval world didn't just inherit classical knowledge, it received it secondhand, filtered through the survival instincts of men who'd risked everything to carry it across borders. But the darkest twist, some of these saviors became censors themselves. The same priest who rescued pagan philosophy might later redact passages that threatened church doctrine. A Franciscan exiled for heresy in one decade could be burning heretical texts the next, purging ideas too dangerous for his new patrons. Knowledge, it turned out, was power, but only if you controlled who read it and how. The libraries they built became fortresses, their gates guarded by the very men who'd once been locked out. In the shadowy corridors of medieval power, information wasn't just valuable, it was currency, and exiled priests became its most ruthless bankers. Consider Cardinal Giovanni Dandolo, the Venetian cleric cast out of Rome for siding with the wrong faction. Stranded in Avignon with no income, he didn't beg for alms, he opened a clandestine marketplace. For the right price, he'd sell whispers of which cardinals had secret mistresses, which bishops had embezzled crusade funds, even which noble families had pagan ancestors they'd paid to erase from chronicles. But his masterpiece was leaking the private voting pacts of a papal conclave, documents so explosive they forced 3 cardinals to withdraw, swinging the election to his preferred candidate. Dandolo didn't just survive his exile, he profited from it, trading in secrets like a merchant trading spices. This wasn't just gossip peddling, it was geopolitical warfare with a theological veneer. A French priest exiled to England might memorize troop movements from soldiers' confessions, then sell the details to Scottish rebels through coded psalms. In Iberia, banished Mozarabic clergy played both sides of the Reconquista, auctioning Arabic translations of Christian battle plans to Muslim emirs while warning Christian kings of impending raids, for a fee, of course. The smartest operators never dealt directly. They used networks of friars, pilgrims, even repentant prostitutes as couriers, ensuring plausible deniability. One Florentine agent's ledger records payments to a choir of angels, later revealed to be a group of orphaned altar boys who smuggled documents in their hymn books. The morality of this trade defied easy judgment. Was it corruption when a starving priest sold herbal remedies to a queen, knowing the recipes came from forbidden Arabic texts? Or pragmatism when the same priest used the profits to feed a dozen orphaned refugees? The Vatican's own archives are riddled with contradictions. Papal bulls condemned information peddling while quietly reimbursing exiled bishops for expenses incurred gathering intelligence on rival kingdoms. Even saints weren't immune. Thomas Becket's exiled allies famously spread exaggerated accounts of Henry II's cruelty, stories that turned European opinion against England, but which modern historians suspect were embellished for fundraising. Financial survival demanded creativity beyond mere espionage. Some clergy turned their theological training into consulting services. A Dominican exiled from Paris set up shop in Aragon offering sin audits for a donation. He'd analyze a noble's business dealings and pinpoint which transactions risked damnation. Others monetized their connections. The aforementioned Dandolo didn't just sell secrets. He sold access, introducing wealthy merchants to cardinals' nephews for a cut of subsequent bribes. The boldest created subscription models. An English canon in Bruges ran a newsletter service, sending coded updates on political shifts to paying clients, his tiered pricing revealing an early grasp of information asymmetry. Patrons who paid double received warnings about which ships might mysteriously sink with their cargo. What makes these strategies so fascinating is their modernity. The exiled priest who auctioned indulgences to fund his return wasn't just a hustler, he was an early venture capitalist trading spiritual futures. The bishop who took commissions for annulling inconvenient marriages operated like a medieval fixer, his ledger a precursor to offshore banking. Even their accounting tricks feel contemporary. One ledger from Cologne shows a Franciscan cooking his books by listing bribes as alms for the poor and blackmail payouts as penitential donations. Yet for all their ingenuity, these men walked a razor's edge. The same Venetian cardinal who manipulated a papal election died poisoned, his wine laced by a rival's agent. The French priest selling military secrets vanished after sending one last note. They know. Perhaps that's the ultimate lesson of this gray economy, that in the medieval world, information was power but rarely protection. The exiled priests who thrived weren't just the best informed. They were the ones who remembered that every secret has a half-life, and no ally stays bought forever. Blessed bankers explore how some clergy mastered finance, managing royal treasuries or minting coins. Their fiscal skills, like those of Jewish converts in Spain, blurred sacred and profane. Yet wealth attracted envy, setting up their eventual falls. In the dim candlelight of medieval counting houses, a peculiar sight unfolded: tonsured heads bent over ledgers, ink-stained fingers tallying silver marks and grain taxes. These weren't merchants, they were priests who traded scripture for spreadsheets, their rosaries swapped for abacuses. Take Bishop Henry of Winchester, once a humble monk who transformed England's treasury into the most efficient financial machine since Roman times. His innovation, a system of tally sticks notched pieces of wood recording debts that became so trusted they circulated like currency. But Henry's genius wasn't just arithmetic, it was optics. He framed loans to bankrupt nobles as acts of Christian charity, while quietly charging interest disguised as administrative fees. The church might forbid usury, but no canon law stopped a bishop from profiting on royal desperation. The real masters of sacred finance emerged where faiths collided. In reconquered Spain, Jewish converts, many forced into baptism, brought generations of banking knowledge to cathedral treasuries. Men like Alfonso de Cartagena, a rabbi's son turned bishop, revolutionized Castile's economy by introducing double-entry bookkeeping from Islamic Sicily. His ledgers didn't just track coins, they mapped power. One page might list a king's loans, while the opposite column noted which noble families owed him favors, a financial web where every debt was also a leash. Yet these arrangements came with peril. When a Cistercian monk in Burgundy tried replicating Alfonso's methods, his abbey was raided by knights screaming, "Christ is not a tax collector." The lesson was clear. Financial innovation walked a knife's edge between reverence and resentment. Minting coins became another clandestine art. Archbishop Wichman of Magdeburg didn't just oversee souls, he controlled the silver mines of the Harz Mountains, striking pennies stamped with his own face beside Christ's. This wasn't vanity, it was branding. By making his visage as familiar as the cross, Wichman ensured traders from Novgorod to Naples associated stability with his rule. But imitation bred danger. When counterfeiters flooded Saxony with debased copies, the archbishop responded with a brutality that shocked even battle-hardened knights. Public burnings for forgers, their melted lead poured into their mouths as communion. Such violence exposed the contradiction at finance's heart. The same church that preached mercy could unleash hell when its wealth was threatened. The downfall of these holy bankers often began with whispers. A French abbot's golden chalice at Mass might spark rumors he'd embezzled pilgrimage donations. A Portuguese cardinal's sudden purchase of Venetian silk could prompt questions about who exactly funded his modest living. Envy festered fastest among those excluded from the money flow. Bishop Richard of London learned this too late when his own clergy denounced him for hoarding wool tariffs meant for the poor, never mind that he'd used those funds to bribe Viking raiders away from the Thames. Stripped of his titles, Richard died chained in a tower, his once immaculate account books gnawed to pulp by rats. What makes their stories so compelling is the duality they embodied. These men genuinely believed financial stewardship was godly work, yet couldn't resist the temptations of wealth. They built hospitals with one hand while rigging grain markets with the other. Perhaps that's why their legacy split so dramatically. Some remembered as saints who funded cathedrals, others as villains who sold indulgences. In the end, their ledgers didn't just record transactions. They became confessionals, inked in numbers instead of sins. And like all confessions, they revealed truths far messier than the tidy moralities preached from pulpits. The Exiled Priests Survival Manual had no official title, just 1,000 unwritten rules scribbled in the margins of desperation. Some changed their names like snakes shedding skin, becoming someone new before crossing the next border. A French canon fleeing papal wrath might reappear in Germany as Brother Matthias, his past buried beneath a borrowed identity and a carefully cultivated local accent. Others mastered the art of forgery, their skilled hands altering dates on letters of recommendation or stitching counterfeit seals onto travel permits. Documents weren't just papers, they were lifelines, and these men learned to weave them from thin air. But the most daring reinvented themselves through sheer theatricality. Take the Flemish priest who staged his own miracle in a Bavarian village, planting a rusted crucifix that wept saffron-infused oil to attract noble patrons. His gamble paid off within months. He'd secured a position as chaplain to a gullible countess. Such performances weren't just deceit, they were acts of survival in a world where legitimacy was currency. A banished cleric with no connections could starve in a ditch, but one with a reputation for holiness. He'd dine at high tables, his past sins conveniently forgotten beneath the glow of manufactured divinity. Adaptation went deeper than paperwork or theatrics. Many exiled priests became cultural chameleons, shedding the liturgical customs of their homelands like outgrown habits. A Spanish friar in Poland might swap his traditional black robe for local gray wool, or learn to chant Slavonic hymns with deliberate mispronunciations to blend in. Food became another tool of disguise. Those who adopted regional dishes, like a Sicilian priest mastering the art of Hungarian goulash, found doors opened faster. These weren't just practical choices, they were psychological armor. The quicker an exile could mimic his surroundings, the sooner suspicion faded into acceptance. Yet behind every clever reinvention lay a quieter, more corrosive cost. The journals of these men reveal the toll of perpetual performance. One anonymous chronicle from a Burgundian monastery describes a priest who confessed to wearing his false self so long, "I've forgotten which prayers were ever truly mine." Others grappled with guilt, like the Irish monk who fabricated a noble lineage to secure patronage, only to suffer nightmares of his real peasant father cursing him from the grave. The strain of duality could fracture even the strongest minds. Records from a Franciscan asylum in Padua tell of an exiled bishop who insisted on answering only to names plucked randomly from scripture, his identity shattered into 1,000 borrowed shards. What's striking is how their coping mechanisms mirrored modern refugee experiences. Some clung to tiny fragments of home. A Welsh priest carried a single hazel nut in his pocket for years, a tactile reminder of the forests he'd lost. Others compartmentalized ruthlessly, like the Castilian cleric who divided his life into "the man I was" and "the man this kingdom needs," switching between them like liturgical vestments. The luckiest found solidarity among fellow exiles, forming underground networks where they could briefly drop their masks. Letters between these groups reveal heartbreaking tenderness, a Saxon bishop sending another a pressed oak leaf from their homeland, or a shared code where certain psalm verses meant, "I remember who you really are." The cruelest irony, the very traits that ensured their survival often made returning impossible. A priest who'd spent decades pretending devotion to a foreign saint might find his old diocese now considered him a heretic. Those who'd forged documents to eat could later be accused of forging sacraments to save souls. In the end, their reinventions didn't just protect them, they trapped them, leaving many suspended between worlds, forever strangers to both. Perhaps that's why so many exiled clergy's final requests were so specific: burial facing east, toward a homeland they could no longer name aloud, under a tombstone bearing whichever identity had lasted the longest. Not the one they were born with, but the one that had kept them alive long enough to be buried at all. Exile didn't just displace priests from their homes, it cracked open the very foundations of their faith. Imagine kneeling in a borrowed chapel, whispering the same prayers you'd spoken since ordination, only to feel the words crumble like stale bread in your mouth. For some, like the Dominican mystic Meister Eckhart, banishment became a crucible for radical devotion. Stripped of his pulpit in Strasbourg, Eckhart didn't just cling to piety, he reinvented it, preaching that God could be found in the soul's deepest voids, not just grand cathedrals. His sermons, scribbled in exile and smuggled back to Germany, turned heresy into revelation, arguing that true holiness required losing everything, even one's sense of divine certainty. But Eckhart's path was rare. More often, the spiritual toll of exile left priests gasping between two abysses, clinging to a God who'd allowed their ruin, or succumbing to the chilling realization that their vocation had always been political theater. The records of a confessor in Avignon paint a haunting picture. One anonymous bishop, exiled after a failed revolt in Milan, confessed he'd begun performing Mass mechanically, his hands moving through the rites while his mind calculated which noble might hire him next. "I trade in blessings like a moneylender trades coins," he wrote, "and wonder if heaven now charges interest." Others coped by numbing themselves with wine or scribbling furious treatises accusing the church of corruption only to burn them at dawn, terrified their new patrons might discover the betrayal. The psychological whiplash was brutal. These were men trained to offer spiritual certainty, now drowning in doubt. A Franciscan chronicle from Padua describes an exiled priest who woke his brothers nightly, screaming that the devil sat on his chest, whispering that his sacraments were empty gestures. Yet amid this unraveling, unexpected transformations emerged. Some clergy, like the Beguine mystic Marguerite Porete, burned at the stake but immortalized by her exiled followers, turned their marginalization into fuel for revolutionary theology. Her mirror of simple souls passed hand to hand like contraband, argued that divine love existed beyond church walls, a notion so threatening it got her killed but inspired underground movements for centuries. Others channeled their crises into quiet acts of rebellion. A parish priest exiled to the Scottish Highlands, forbidden to preach, spent his days teaching shepherds to read the Psalms in their own Gaelic, an act of defiance disguised as charity, preserving faith by breaking the rules meant to enforce it. The most poignant struggles were those left unresolved. The diary of a Castilian friar exiled to Portugal details his daily ritual. At sunset, he'd face the direction of his lost monastery and recite the Te Deum, not in gratitude but as a challenge to God. "If you are just," he scrawled in the margins, "why let men cloak vengeance in your name?" His pages show no neat conclusion, only a life suspended between devotion and disillusion. That tension, more than any sermon or scandal, captures the exiled priest's defining paradox. To survive, they had to question everything they'd once sworn was unshakable. And in that questioning, they didn't just lose or find faith, they rewrote what it meant to believe at all. What lingers isn't whether these men kept their faith intact, but how their fractures reshaped spirituality itself. Eckhart's heresies birthed German mysticism. Porete's ashes fertilized medieval feminism. Even the cynics, by exposing the gulf between divine ideals and human institutions, forced Christianity to confront its own contradictions. Their crises weren't endings, they were fault lines where faith, like the priests themselves, broke apart only to rise again in forms no one could predict. The echoes of medieval exiled priests resonate in the corridors of modern diplomacy, where asylum-seeking scholars and displaced intellectuals wield influence far beyond their official titles. Like their medieval counterparts, today's dissident thinkers, whether Syrian academics in Berlin or Venezuelan economists in Miami, arrive in foreign lands carrying more than just personal trauma. They bring insider knowledge, cultural fluency, and the ability to reframe conflicts in ways that shift geopolitical chessboards. Consider how Russian defectors in the Cold War mirrored the medieval clergy's dual allegiances, whispering intelligence to Western handlers while maintaining shadow ties to old networks. Or how Chinese dissidents in exile today leverage social media to amplify dissent, just as banished bishops once used smuggled sermons to undermine rival rulers. The tools have changed, but the playbook remains startlingly similar. Turn displacement into leverage and trade access for protection. Yet the parallels go deeper than espionage. Modern soft power, the use of culture and ideas to influence without force, traces its roots to these medieval intermediaries. When a Turkish poet exiled in Germany writes verses that bridge Islamic mysticism and European humanism, or when an Iranian filmmaker in Paris crafts movies critiquing the regime, they're following a path forged by clerics who translated Arabic science for Christian kings or used illuminated manuscripts to smuggle political critiques. Even the Vatican's current practice of sheltering persecuted intellectuals, like the Cuban priests hosted in Rome, mirrors the Benedictine monasteries that harbored heretical scholars under the guise of spiritual retreat. The exiled clergy's greatest innovation, transforming cultural capital into political weight, is now standard practice in global diplomacy, but their legacy carries warnings as sharp as their triumphs. The same strategies that elevated exiled priests playing patrons against each other, weaponizing nostalgia, trading secrets for survival, now fuel modern crises. Look at how some post-Soviet oligarchs, exiled in London, pivot between laundering reputations through philanthropy and funneling dark money into destabilizing campaigns. Or how authoritarian regimes today weaponize diaspora communities, using exiled dissidents as bargaining chips in negotiations, just as medieval kings dangled the prospect of return to manipulate banished bishops. The darkest lesson power granted to exiles is always provisional. For every Andrei Sakharov embraced by the West, there's a Julian Assange trapped in legal limbo, a reminder that sanctuary can become a gilded cage when its usefulness expires. Perhaps the most enduring thread is the paradox of the exile's gaze forever split between past and present. Medieval clergy wrote chronicles glorifying lost homelands while advising new rulers on how to conquer them. Today's exiled journalists broadcast from democratic capitals while their reporting fuels revolutions back home. This duality shapes history. The Armenian scribe who preserved his culture under Ottoman rule now has a counterpart in the Ukrainian software developer coding anti-propaganda tools from a Warsaw apartment. Both prove that exile doesn't just preserve culture, it incubates resistance. The final irony: the very systems that once persecuted these intermediaries now rely on their heirs. Modern intelligence agencies recruit refugee linguists to decode enemy communications, just as medieval kings employed exiled priests to interpret foreign courts. Universities vie for displaced professors, knowing their insights come bundled with networks no diplomat could access. Even the Catholic Church, which once banished reformers, now staffs its think tanks with theologians fleeing persecution. The wheel has turned full circle. The outcasts of one age become the power brokers of the next, their value measured not in titles, but in their ability to bridge worlds and to remember what those in power forget. What medieval exiles understood, and what we're still grappling with, is that no border can contain an idea. Whether carried in a monk's satchel or a dissident's encrypted hard drive, knowledge refuses to stay where it's planted. And those who transport it voluntarily or not don't just adapt to new lands. They reshape them, one whispered truth, one translated text, one recalibrated alliance at a time. The stakes today are higher, the tools faster, but the game remains the same. Survival is just the beginning. Influence is the real prize, and the price, as always, is paid in fragments of the self, left behind in every homeland, traded away in every deal, scattered like parchment ashes across the map of history. The difference between exiled priests who rose to power and those who vanished into obscurity often came down to three ruthlessly practical virtues: humility that masked ambition, adaptability that bordered on reinvention, and the discipline to measure every word as if it might be their last. Consider the contrasting fates of two bishops exiled during the same English Civil War. Robert of Hereford arrived in Normandy with chests of vestments and demands for suitable housing, alienating potential patrons with his air of unshaken privilege. Within months, he was begging for bread at monastery gates. By contrast, Thomas of Worcester entered France with nothing but a satchel and a willingness to serve, offering his legal expertise to local lords in exchange for modest shelter. Within 2 years, he drafted treaties that ended border conflicts, earning himself a permanent seat at the royal council. Their stories reveal a harsh truth: exile didn't care about former glory. It rewarded those who could shed their past like a snake sheds skin. Adaptability went beyond mere survival skills. It was about rewriting one's spiritual resume on the fly. A Cistercian monk expelled from Burgundy for austerity might refashion himself as a luxury advisor in Milan. interpreting his order's agricultural expertise into vineyard management for thirsty nobles. The key lay in translation, not of language but of value. When Archbishop Anselm was exiled from England, he didn't insist on his Canterbury titles. He repositioned himself as a scholar, publishing theological works that made him indispensable to the Pope. Meanwhile, his contemporary Bishop Odo clung to outdated claims of authority and died forgotten in a Flemish tavern. The lesson, influence in exile, wasn't taken, it was earned through relentless relevance. Strategic silence proved the most potent weapon of all. The Vatican's archives contain a revealing marginal note from Cardinal Bessarion. 3 things never to discuss in exile: your true thoughts on the Pope, your homeland's weaknesses, and what you miss most. The priests who thrived mastered the art of speaking volumes without saying anything. A Hungarian cleric exiled to Vienna spent years nodding sympathetically to Habsburg complaints about Ottoman threats, all while secretly documenting their military vulnerabilities for future leverage. His journals show meticulous calculations when to feign ignorance, when to offer just enough insight to remain valuable, but never enough to become expendable. This wasn't deceit, it was the arithmetic of survival. Modern leaders facing displacement, whether corporate exiles after mergers or refugees fleeing conflict, can trace their playbook to these medieval survivors. A tech CEO ousted from Silicon Valley doesn't rage against former boards. They pivot to advising startups, trading insider knowledge for equity. Like Bishop Thierry translating Arabic medical texts, today's displaced professionals repackage their expertise for new markets. The Syrian doctor driving a Berlin taxi isn't failing, they're observing, adapting, waiting for the moment their skills regain currency. Yet the darkest parallel lies in how power forgives what weakness punishes. When King John of England recalled Archbishop Langton from exile, the cleric's years of principled resistance were recast as noble sacrifice. Meanwhile, lesser priests who'd compromised too visibly were scapegoated as traitors. The same pattern plays out in modern boardrooms and revolutions. Those who return victorious write the narrative, while those who bent too far break under retrospective scrutiny. Exile's final lesson: survival isn't enough. You must ensure your story survives with you, polished by selective silence and strategic reminders of why you were worth sheltering in the first place. The fallen left warnings written in their failures: arrogance that couldn't conceive of diminished status, rigidity that mistook compromise for corruption, and tongues that loosened when wine or loneliness flowed. Their graves, scattered across foreign churchyards, whisper the same epitaph: he forgot he was no longer home. The survivors, by contrast, embraced exile's brutal gift, the chance to become someone new, unshackled by who they'd once been. In that transformation lay not just survival, but a kind of power no crown could bestow: the ability to shape-shift through crises, leaving ghosts of former selves behind like stepping stones across a torrent. Hollywood would have us believe medieval exiled priests were silver-haired sages wandering misty forests, dispensing wisdom between verses of Gregorian chant. The truth, many were closer to cutthroat political operatives in clerical garb, their robes stained with ink, wine, and occasionally blood. Consider Bishop Arnulf of Lycia, exiled for backing the wrong claimant to the English throne. Far from a contemplative hermit, he spent his banishment bribing Norman barons, forging land deeds, and allegedly poisoning a rival's hunting dogs. His personal letters reveal a man who quoted Cicero on justice while tallying debts owed by fellow exiles like a loan shark. This wasn't spirituality, it was survival cubed. The romantic image of the holy wanderer crumbles further when examining financial records. Monastery ledgers from 12th century France show exiled bishops amassing personal fortunes through shady deals. One entry describes a certain Brother Gilham purchasing Venetian trade permits under a false name, then leasing them to Jewish merchants at triple the price, all while publicly preaching against usury. Even saintly reputations were often carefully manufactured. When Archbishop Anselm needed to rehabilitate his image after exile, he commissioned biographers to depict him writing theology in moonlit solitude. The manuscripts tell a different story, marginal notes about bribing papal legates and complaints about the stingy portions at his host monastery. Ambition burned especially bright among younger exiled clergy. The diary of a disgraced deacon named Raymond, found in a Catalan archive, lays bare the calculus. If I cannot be first in Toulouse, I will make myself indispensable in Barcelona. Within months of his banishment, he'd ingratiated himself with the local count by discovering an ancient prophecy conveniently predicting the count's lineage would produce a saint. The gamble paid off. Raymond became court chaplain, his past sins forgotten. These weren't holy men corrupted by exile. They were often strivers from the start, using the church as a ladder that happened to have rungs in heaven. The most successful exiles mastered a double act, pious enough to satisfy patrons, pragmatic enough to exploit them. Cardinal Wolsey didn't just advise Henry Roman VIII, he built Hampton Court as a palace befitting his own power, its ceilings adorned with his personal emblem alongside saints. Yet even Wolsey paled next to Archbishop Adalbert of Hamburg, who turned his exile into an empire. Shipwrecked on the Baltic coast after fleeing Saxony, he convinced local Slavs he was a sorcerer who could control storms. By the time German knights arrived to rescue him, he'd amassed a private army and a harem, claiming both were necessary for missionary work. What makes these flawed figures fascinating isn't their sins, but their sheer humanity. A recently decoded psalter from Metz contains scribbles between prayers, shopping lists, crude doodles of rivals, even a recipe for hangover cure, a garlic, honey, and regrettable life choices. These marginalia reveal men who fretted over gout and bad wine even as they shaped kingdoms. Their legacy isn't diminished by their flaws, it's deepened. To understand how a penniless exile could become a chancellor or a heretic could found a dynasty, we must discard the stained glass stereotypes and see them as they were, brilliant, ruthless, and utterly human. The real miracle wasn't their piety, it was their ability to turn the ultimate rejection exile into the ultimate power move. Shakespeare's Cardinal Wolsey in Henry Roman VIII collapses under the weight of his own ambition, his red robes pooling around him like spilled wine as he laments, "Had I but served my God with half the zeal I served my king." The scene is pure drama, but it's also pure fiction. The real Wolsey died in disgrace, yes, but not before secretly negotiating his return to favor right up to his final breath. That tension between myth and reality runs like a golden thread through literature's exiled clergy. George R.R. Martin's High Sparrow in Game of Thrones, a barefoot fanatic who topples queens, echoes the historical Peter Waldo, who traded wealth for rags and turned exile into a weapon. But where Martin's sparrow schemed in shadows, Waldo's followers died singing hymns as flames consumed them. Fiction loves the archetype of the holy outcast who wields moral authority like a blade, yet the truth was often messier, darker, and far more inventive. Take Victor Hugo's Bishop Myriel in Les Miserables, a beacon of mercy who forgives even the thief stealing his silver. The character was inspired by real exiled bishops who sheltered revolutionaries, but Hugo glossed over their pragmatism. The historical Bishop Felix of Nantes didn't just absolve sins, he stockpiled grain during famines to control local nobles, trading salvation for political leverage. Or consider Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, where the exiled friar William of Baskerville unravels heresies with Sherlockian logic. Eco borrowed liberally from the life of Roger Bacon, a Franciscan exiled for dabbling in forbidden science. But while William solves murders, Bacon spent his banishment sketching flying machines and gunpowder formulas, visions too radical even for fiction. The gap between portrayal and reality widens when you examine how literature sanitizes their flaws. Dostoevsky's father Zosima in The Brothers Karamazov radiates saintly wisdom, yet his real-life counterparts often wrestled with doubt. The exiled Russian monk Nil Sorsky famously wrote, "The closer I crawl to God, the more I reek of my own hypocrisy." Even the Canterbury Tales worldly friar who pocketed coins from widows pales next to the genuine corruption of Bishop Pietro Corchon, the architect of Joan of Arc's trial, who rigged her execution while drafting pious sermons about mercy. Perhaps the most striking distortion lies in their endings. Fictional exiled priests often die as martyrs or redeemers, their deaths imbued with meaning. Shakespeare's Thomas Becket meets his fate in a cathedral, his blood sanctifying the stones, but history's exiles frequently vanished without fanfare. The real Becket's exiled allies rotted in foreign dungeons, their names erased from chronicles. For every heroic cardinal in the Three Musketeers, there were 100 forgotten priests who starved in alpine passes, their bones ground to dust by avalanches. Yet one truth transcends both fiction and history: the exiled priest's uncanny ability to shape narratives. Chaucer's pardoner peddles fake relics with a smirk, yet his real-world equivalent, like the conman monk Francois Prelotti, convinced a 15th-century noble he could summon demons to kill the King of France. The difference: Prelotti's lies sparked actual treason trials, while the pardoner's tale ends with a punchline. That's the alchemy literature can't quite capture. How these men didn't just inspire stories, but became stories, their lives morphing into legends that outran the facts. Our final case study, the Borgias legend. Showtime's The Borgias paints Cardinal della Rovere as a righteous foil to Rodrigo Borgia's corruption. In reality, della Rovere was exiled for embezzlement, then clawed his way back to power by bribing mercenaries and forging papal decrees. When he finally became Pope Julius Roman II, he commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel, not for God's glory, but to outshine his rivals. Fiction gives us tidy arcs of sin and redemption. History gives us a man who weaponized art to spite his enemies, proving exile didn't strip these men of ambition. It sharpened it into something too complex for any playwright to contain. The Baltic Sea in the 14th century was no place for the faint of heart. Its icy waters teemed with rival merchant fleets, privateers flying false colors, and the occasional Viking holdout still clinging to old raiding ways. But none struck fear into coastal towns quite like the galleys flying a banner no one expected to see aboard a pirate ship, the cross of a bishopric. Meet Henry of Minden, the so-called pirate bishop, a man who transformed from disgraced clergyman to the most feared sea raider of his age. Exiled from his diocese after a bloody feud with local nobles, Henry didn't slink away to a monastery. Instead, he commandeered 3 merchant ships, armed them with scavenged cannons, and declared himself God's Admiral, a title as audacious as it was illegal. Henry's tactics were as unorthodox as his vocation. While most pirates aimed for loot, the bishop-turned raider prioritized humiliation. He'd board Hanseatic trading vessels and force captured merchants to confess their sins before tossing their cargo overboard, keeping only the wine which he claimed was sacramental. His flagship, ironically named the Penitent, became a floating court where he presided over mock trials, sentencing rival nobles to walk the plank, a wooden beam extended over calm waters, more theater than threat. Yet beneath the theatrics lay shrewd strategy. By framing his piracy as divine retribution, Henry turned greed into spectacle, ensuring his exploits spread faster than any mundane thieves. What's truly startling isn't that Henry fell from grace, it's how he clawed his way back. After years of terrorizing trade routes, he pulled off the ultimate reinvention. With the Teutonic Knights bogged down in war, Henry offered his fleet to ferry their troops in exchange for absolution. The deal stank of hypocrisy, but desperation made strange bedfellows. By the time his ships delivered knights to the Battle of Grunwald, his crimes were rebranded as youthful zeal. The Pope, eager to spin the saga into a tale of redemption, not only pardoned Henry but reinstated him as bishop, this time with a fortified coastal diocese, as if rewarding his nautical expertise. The pirate bishop's legacy exposes the fluidity of medieval justice. Henry's story wasn't just about survival, it was about audacity rewriting the rules. Where others saw exile as an ending, he treated it as a blank parchment one he could scrawl with cannon smoke and stolen sacramental wine. His rise, fall, and second act prove an uncomfortable truth. In an era where power was performance, even holiness could be stolen back at sword point. Centuries may separate us from those exiled priests, but their struggles feel hauntingly familiar, like a medieval manuscript whose ink bleeds into modern parchment. Think of today's refugee scholars fleeing war zones, their doctorates as portable as those priests' theological training. Or consider the tech workers displaced by corporate upheavals, reinventing themselves just as Bishop Anselm pivoted from political exile to theological influencer. The parallels aren't coincidental, they're human. Migration still forces the same impossible choices: assimilate entirely and lose yourself, or cling too tightly to the past and remain forever an outsider. What those medieval clergy mastered and what modern nomads are relearning is the delicate art of selective adaptation. A Syrian architect driving Uber in Berlin today channels the same survival calculus as a 12th century monk trading Latin lessons for shelter. Leverage what you carry to build bridges, not walls. Resilience, too, wears the same face across time. The pirate bishop's audacious reinvention mirrors Afghan journalists launching underground radio stations from European basements, both turning dispossession into defiance. And when we see Ukrainian artists painting murals of their homeland on Warsaw's walls, we're witnessing the same impulse that drove exiled Irish monks to carve Celtic crosses into Bavarian oak. Trauma transmuted into art, memory made tangible. These aren't just survival tactics, they're alchemy, spinning loss into legacy. Yet the most potent lesson lies in their relationship with power. Like modern whistleblowers or dissident writers, those priests understood that true influence often blooms farthest from traditional centers of authority. A bishop whispering counsel in a foreign king's ear was the medieval equivalent of a banned author going viral on Substack, both proving that ideas once loose in the world defy borders and banishments. Their lives whisper a challenge to us. What might we carry and what might we dare to reinvent when the ground vanishes beneath our feet? So we'd love to hear which of these stories gripped you. Was it the knowledge broker monks saving civilization one smuggled manuscript at a time, the pirate bishop laughing in the face of disgrace? Or perhaps the quieter tales like that friar teaching shepherds to read under northern stars? Drop your thoughts below, and if these hidden histories resonated, hit subscribe. Because the past's outcasts have a way of becoming the future's compass, and their footsteps still mark paths